So good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Beth Hawley with the Arizona Association of Realtors, and we're proud to bring you these free webinars designed exclusively for Arizona Realtors. Today's webinar is Property Conditions, Obligations, Do's, and Don'ts with Trudy Moore. Trudy is the designated broker for HomeSmart in Scottsdale and has been in the real estate industry in the Phoenix metro area since 1984. Today's presentation will be about 35 to 45 minutes. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the question box and we will try to get them answered at the conclusion. If you'd like to expand the size of the webcam video, simply click on the line separating the video from the PowerPoint and drag. As always, today's webinar will be recorded and available next week on our website at AAR Online. So welcome, Trudy. It's a pleasure having you here today.
Well, thanks for asking me, Beth. Today, we're going to talk about the property condition, what the obligations are for the buyer and the seller, and we're going to talk about some good practices, some do's, and we're going to talk about some don'ts. And sometimes we learn more from the don't, how not to do something. So we're going to talk about that as we go through about some bad situations that happen so you can know what not to do. So property condition, as long as I have been in the business, the condition of the property continues to be the #1 claim in lawsuits and E&O claims. And even though we've made great strides over the years in trying to get the condition of the property to the buyer so the buyer understands, it still continues to be the #1 claim. And that's because the buyer moves in and the buyer is surprised by something. And once they become surprised and say the seller didn't disclose this, this, and this, then they think, you know, what else didn't the seller disclose to me? So the buyer's surprised, they become unhappy. A couple things we can do right at the very onset of working with a buyer is what we call buyer counseling. So when you're working with the buyer, even at your first meeting with the buyer, you want to make sure that you give them a copy of the contract so they can read through it, they can get any questions that they might have for you. But you want to talk with the buyer about what they can expect. And the buyer advisory is also a really good guide in talking with the buyer about the inspection period. So we're going to tell the buyer, unless they're buying a new construction home, there's not one house out there that is going to be perfect. There's a lot of them that might come back really good and not too many things to fix, but there are absolutely going to be things on the home inspection that the buyer's going to have to make a decision. Is that something I want to take care of myself? Is that something I want to ask the seller to take care of? So when you're talking about the home inspection process, you may even want to show them a copy of a past home inspection just so the buyer gets an idea. They're going to have like 45 pages of everything about that property. Same thing on the listing appointment. You want to set expectations for the seller. And the good news is that lots of sellers are also moving on and going to be purchasing another home as well. So when you talk with them at the listing appointment, a lot of that information you can then use when you represent them as a buyer. But at the listing appointment, you want to make sure that you give the seller a copy of the SPUDs, let them know that this is a document that is there as their friend to protect them, and that also when you give them a copy of the purchase contract like you did the buyer, you're going to want to let the seller know that during the first 10 days, the buyer is going to do an inspection. And there is a good possibility the buyer is going to come back and ask for things that the seller's not willing to do. It may be a very, very long, lengthy list. It may be a short list. But to not take it personally that the buyer is going to go through their home inspection report and they're going to list things that they're going to want the seller to do, you know, repairs before the close of escrow. And if there are things that you know are going to come up on a home inspection and that the buyer typically is going to request, Maybe the seller wants to take care of that prior to putting it on the market. You then can have a copy of that receipt, which you can attach to the spuds. And then the buyer can, of course, disclose whatever repairs that they made. But if you know that things are wrong, you and the seller need to discuss, based on the price, is this something that the seller might want to take care of prior to even putting the property on the market. So listing appointment, very important to set those expectations for the seller. So once we get under contract, there's no surprises. Okay, so the AAR purchase contract, as we all know, was revised and came out in February of this year. The seller warranted items were in the purchase contract for just about as long as I can remember. Over the years, interestingly, the termites used to be a warranted item. That was removed. The roof used to be a warranted item years ago. That was removed. And so I can't say that I was surprised in February of this year when the contract came out that we basically removed all of the seller warranted items. And the properties now are what some people call in as-is condition. We don't like to really use that word as is. We like to use the word present physical condition, and that's the language taken directly from the purchase contract. The as-is addendum also went away shortly after the new contract came out. So there is no reason that you should be including an as-is addendum, and it's off zip form, so the only place you'd have it is if you made copies of it, but there's no real reason to use it anymore. So present physical condition is how all the properties now in Arizona are sold, unless you're one of those agents that might be writing something in and maybe trying to add those warranted items back in. Let's see. There we go. So the seller property disclosure statement, as I stated a little bit earlier, the SPUDS, as it's known, is a friend of the seller's. Okay, the seller has an obligation in the state of Arizona to disclose anything that might materially or adversely affect the buyer's decision to buy. This document was created to give the seller a vehicle to disclose that. It's a seller's friend, and it helps them comply with the law. The SPUDS is updated from time to time as different statutes and different rules change in Arizona as well. But probably the most important document after the purchase contract in any real estate transaction. So some of the top questions I get about the SPUDS is, when should the SPUDS be completed? And in my opinion, the best time for the SPUDS to be completed is at the listing agreement. The SPUDS is going to ask questions like, are you aware of any problems with the pool equipment or the pool heater? And if that pool heater doesn't work, that's where the seller is going to go ahead and let you know that they haven't used the pool heater in 25 years. So that's a heads up to you as well, to make sure that when you're marketing the property and things like that, that you're doing it correctly. So when you get that SPUDS at the time of the listing agreement, it's always important for you to read through it and make any notes of something that a buyer might ask. If the listing's been on the market for, say, 90 days or more, I would highly recommend that you give the SPUDS back to the seller when the contract comes in and ask them to update it. Has anything changed over the last 90 days? And they can do that on the last page of the SPUDS by initialing as well. Oops, there we go. Okay, and why would a seller not complete a SPUDS? So, lots of different reasons. I think the number one reason is that somewhere along the line, they have been told that it's not good for them, either from a friend or another agent, that it's creating additional liability for them, which is totally incorrect in my opinion. The SPUDS is there and allows the seller to go ahead and disclose what they know about the property. Also, I have lazy there. I think sometimes sellers and sometimes agents as well think it's just easier. I don't have the time. I'm not going to go ahead and have my seller fill out the seller property disclosure statement. Please, please do not give advice to a seller to not fill it out. Because if there's a claim or something later, the first thing that everyone's going to look at is, was there a SPUDS? Did the seller disclose it? So please, please make sure that your sellers are always filling out that SPUDS. And also, when you're representing a buyer in a transaction, not a good idea to waive the SPUDS under the additional terms and conditions. Okay, because if you were buying a property, would you want to know everything that the seller knows about that property if you were the buyer? And I think we all would say, yes, we'd like to know that. So waiving it under the additional terms and conditions is not a good idea when you're representing a buyer as well. So what to do if the seller's never lived in the property? Do they still need to complete a SPUDS? Absolutely, they need to do that. The questions on the SPUDS have nothing to do with if the seller is residing in the property or has ever resided in the property. I think one of the first questions on the first page is, what year was it built? Okay, that's information that either you know or you don't know. Is the property vacant? Have you entered into any sort of option agreement with the property? Is FIRPTA going to apply? Those are all questions that the seller can answer. Years ago on the SPUDS, we had a middle column that was an NA or doesn't apply. Now, the way that the questions are worded, is the seller aware of any roof leaks? It's either yes or no. Either you're aware or you're not aware. And that SPUDS is where the seller is going to disclose all the things. When calls come in at our brokerage to any of the brokerage team members, and it's an agent stating, my seller wants to know if they need to disclose X, Y, or Z. If they're asking the question, there is a 99% chance that we're going to say, yes, if you're asking, it needs to go on the SPUDS. Is that something that you, Mr. and Mr. Seller, if you were buying this home, is that information you would want to know? So I always err on the side of disclosing absolutely everything and telling people, chances are, if you call in and ask me the question, it's going to be, yes, we want you to disclose that. Okay, and what if I explain the importance of the SPUDS and the seller still refuses to complete it? This happens from time to time. Not every state actually has a SPUDS, so they may be a seller from out of Arizona. If this happens, you want to make sure that you discuss with your broker and see if this is actually a seller that you want to represent. You can also have the seller sign a statement that you highly recommend that they complete it and that they have elected to not do so. So if there's a claim or a lawsuit afterwards, we can't have the seller coming back and saying, my listing agent said it wasn't important, don't worry about it, we don't need to, you've never lived there, it's been a rental property. So make sure you get something from the seller stating that you've recommended that they do it, that they complete that SPUDS, and that they're electing not to do so. Okay, the buyer inspection notice seller response, or the BINSR. We see so many issues and problems in the industry with the BINSR, and there is quite frankly no right or wrong way to write a BINSR, but there are certainly some things that we're going to talk about that help it be an easier process between the agents. And the first thing is that you want to make sure that you are absolutely crystal clear on what it is that the buyer is requesting be done. You want to make sure that if the faucet in the bathroom is leaking, that you're going to state, is the faucet to be replaced? Is it to be repaired? You want to be absolutely crystal clear. And you also want to, refer back to that conversation you had with the buyer when you first met the buyer during that interview. we're not going to probably request absolutely everything that is wrong with the property, but we're going to go ahead and ask the seller to complete the items that are most important to you, maybe the items that are going to be costly, maybe they're going to be items that might even affect an appraisal down the road. So some of the top BINSR questions that we get is, what do I do if I run out of time? I need to do extra inspections that were recommended on the home inspection? Do I recommend those? I'm sorry, do I recommend those on the home inspection or the BINSR? Absolutely not. One of the problems that we've been seeing recently with BINSRs is that buyers are asking the sellers to do inspections on their request for repairs. If your home inspection says that they recommend that you have a roofer come out and take a look at the roof and you don't have enough time, you're best to request an extension on an addendum for that inspection period. It is not a good idea for the buyer to state, seller to have the roof inspected. We want to make sure that we're not seeing that. That's not what the BINSR is for. What if the utilities are not on? The seller agrees that the utilities are going to be on for all inspections. So if the gas is not on, you could issue a cure notice. Is that something I recommend? Not necessarily. I think you talk with your buyer about the fact that the gas was not turned on and now we're going to need a longer time. So you do an addendum to make sure the seller's got some more time to get that gas turned on. As you and I know, when you issue a cure notice, sometimes that sets off people, and what it does is it just creates an adversarial position right off the bat in a transaction. So there's certainly a time and a place for a cure notice, but you talk with your client about the advantages and disadvantages, and sometimes a simple addendum works better than a cure notice if everyone can agree. So can my buyer just cancel without listing any of the items that they disapproved of on the BINSR? And the answer is no. In the purchase contract, it talks that the buyer is going to list the items that they disapprove of. So you need to be as specific as possible. And if one of my agents is representing a buyer, I would recommend that they list as many items that the buyer disapproved of as possible. There's usually more than one item in there, and if they're truly disapproving because there's just too many, we've got to get in the habit of listing all of those things. We can't just on page 1 of the BINSR state that the buyer's electing to cancel based on the condition. If you have a savvy seller, you may very possibly have a seller that then is going to make a claim for the buyer's earnest money because the buyer didn't follow the purchase contract and list those items. So can I request that the seller use a licensed contractor or have the work done by a certain contractor on the BINSR? And the purchase contract already states that the buyer and seller agree that the work is going to be done in a workmanlike manner. So the BINSR is not the time to renegotiate the contract. If you have a buyer that maybe had a bad experience with an inspection on a previous transaction, or a buyer that absolutely wants the work done by licensed people, that actually needs to be a part of the purchase contract. You need to change that workmanlike manner to licensed contractor. And don't get me wrong, I'm not recommending that agents go in and do that, because there's many things in the contract that don't have to be done by a licensed contractor. Let's say the buyer requested that a stack of 500 bricks be removed before the close of escrow. That's not something that you need a licensed contractor to do. So try to not renegotiate that BINSR, the contract during the BINSR period. Also, from time to time, we will see that the buyer's requesting that the air conditioning unit be repaired by ABC Air Conditioning. Can the buyer do that? Again, the contract has already been decided that it's going to be done in a workmanlike manner. It doesn't say that the buyer is going to get to pick who it is that does the repairs. The seller's the one that's going to be paying for the repairs most likely, so the seller can pick who it is that they want to do the work. However, with that being said, if I'm a seller of a property and the buyer would like the air conditioner replaced or repaired or whatever they specifically requested in the BINSR by ABC Air Conditioning Company, and the cost to use that company is no different than the air conditioning company of the seller's choice, why would you not use the company that the buyer wants? Because if the company makes a mistake or there's questions down the road, it's much better for the seller to say, hey buyer, we used the company you requested, not a company that I picked or a company that maybe they thought I had a relationship with. So you're not going to go ahead and state it has to be done by a licensed contractor. Okay, if that's something when you talk to your buyer originally, you want to make sure that that goes into the contract or on an addendum. You cannot on the BINSR state that they want that it has to be done. They can state that they request, but they can't state that it has to be done. And so handling repair requests on the appraisal. So the contract versus a counter and the appraisal requirements. So if you know that your buyer's getting an FHA or VA loan, and we know that that air conditioner is going to have to be working, is that something we want to address in the purchase contract or in a counteroffer? Probably. But unfortunately, unless the listing agent is aware of the condition and we know the AC doesn't work, we're not going to be able to address that in the counteroffer or in the purchase contract. Now, when you have that seller property disclosure statement completed when you take the listing, I would highly recommend that you upload that into the Documents tab in the MLS, and then the buyers are going to have that, and that would be a good place for the buyer to see what's working, what might not be working. Also, check with your lender if the buyer's getting financing, if you have concerns, and depending upon the type of loan the buyer's getting, the lender may be able to let you know, hey, this is something that's going to have to be working. Same with the swimming pool. Is it if it's empty, is that something that's going to have water in it? If we're aware of it up front, yes, we can address it in the contract or in our counteroffer. So handling any changes to the property condition during the escrow period. So the purchase contract goes on to state that the home is going to be in substantially the same condition at the close of escrow as it was at contract acceptance. So that word substantially, we've argued back and forth over the years many times. So if something has changed, the buyer can certainly request that the seller update the SPUDs, or the seller can proactively go ahead and update the SPUDs. But keep in mind, you're going to give the buyer another 5 days to disapprove once that SPUDs is updated. So it's so important for the buyer and seller to be in communication during the escrow period and to have good communication. And any changes that happen, yes, I would recommend that they go ahead and they complete it on the SPUDs. Now, I think you have to be, there's an element of reasonableness that is implied into every contract. And, if the seller, pruned the rose bushes in the backyard during the escrow period, is that something that needs to be disclosed? Probably not. But if they went ahead and planted trees or repaired the irrigation system, or there was a flood or something to the property, that absolutely has to be disclosed in writing. Okay. And effective communication. We talk about this a lot with the purchase contract. The buyer and seller, the buyer's agent and the seller's agent need to get on the same page about communication early on in the transaction. So I would recommend, if you are the listing agent, that you ask the buyer's agent, would you prefer that I text you, I email you, I call you on the telephone? And if they say, I'm someone who likes to talk on the telephone, and you typically are an emailer, guess what? During that transaction, you're probably going to have to pick up the phone a few more times. Be the one that goes the extra effort to try to accommodate the other agent. The buyer's agent and the listing agent having a good working relationship is key to any successful transaction. Due to salespeople and their personality, sometimes I see salespeople just wanting to be right, over thinking of what's best for the transaction. We want to make sure that the buyer's agent and seller's agent really stay on good terms. It's never fun when we have poor communication and the agents end up getting the brokers involved, and we're trying to figure out what's happened, or someone's been out of town and they're not returning calls or not returning emails. It just makes it uncomfortable and a bad situation for everyone. So one of the key things that I hope you get out of this, even though it's about property condition, it's to communicate effectively, efficiently. Don't be afraid to go to your broker, ask questions. There are no silly questions, so we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and we have good communication throughout the transaction. Okay, and it looks like we have some questions here. And are you going to put those up on the screen, or?
How about I read them?
Perfect.
So what happens when the SPUDS is not provided?
When the SPUDS is not provided, if I'm the buyer's agent, I'm going to go ahead and issue a cure notice to make sure that I document that they haven't provided it. If indeed the listing agent says, sorry, I'm not going to follow the contract, my seller's not going to go ahead and fill out the SPUDS, then the buyer has a decision to make. Once you issue that cure period notice, the buyer then is going to have the opportunity to cancel if the seller doesn't comply. But you want to make sure in that instance that you absolutely issue the cure notice so you've got it documented that you requested it.
So why isn't the SPUDS required in the MLS listing?
Well, the MLS has nothing to do really with the purchase contract. In the state of Arizona, the SPUDS is not a required document. However, the seller is still obligated to disclose in writing those things that are material that they know about the property. So when a seller says, I'm not going to fill it out, or a listing agent says, my seller's not going to fill it out, my question is, well, where is the seller going to disclose those things? I guess they could take a blank white piece of paper and write down the different repairs and things that they've done to the property over the years. But the SPUDS is there to give the seller guidance, to prompt them about, oh yeah, that's right, I did have a leak in the hallway where the evaporative cooler leaked through. So the SPUDS is a good thing for the seller.
Doesn't Arizona require licensed contractors to be used when the repair cost exceeds $1,200?
I'm not an expert in that area, but I believe it's $1,000. So if the repair is over $1,000, then that needs to be done by a licensed contractor. However, you and I know in the real world, there are repairs that are done in excess of $1,000 by unlicensed people all the time. Okay, so the purchase contract doesn't state that the seller is going to use licensed contractors for any repair that exceeds $1,000. Okay, it says that the work is going to be done in a workmanlike manner. So using licensed contractors and even licensed handyman is certainly recommended whenever possible.
So what's a good example for the way to request repairs, like the verbiage you should use to get what you want?
Perfect. So I like to refer to the home inspection, and it may be, section 4.2. And that's going to go ahead and get the listing agent and the seller to the right place in the home inspection report. But then the buyer needs to be very specific about what it is that they're wanting done. So let's say the faucet in the bathroom is leaking. That, like I said before, they have to make sure that they state, do we want the faucet to be leak-free? Do we want the seller to replace the faucet with, another, chrome faucet? You want to be very, very specific about exactly what it is that you want. One of the worst things that you can do is to just list on the BINSR 4.2, 6.8, 9.10. The seller's not going to know what does the buyer want done with those problems. And again, sometimes we can be a little lackadaisical or lazy, and we're just going to write those sections of the home inspection report on that BINSR. It's okay to list it, but you need to then expand on exactly what it is that the buyer wants done.
So have you ever seen any truly bad verbiage for that? Just examples of what absolutely do not do.
Well, what I just stated, don't just list the 4.1, 6.2, and don't list, seller to repair everything on the summary page. Again, that is way too broad, way too general. We want the buyer to be extremely specific. Okay. The other thing that we see is seller to credit the buyer, seller to reduce the purchase price by, $4,500 without listing anything. Okay. The seller's going to come back and say that, no, I'm not willing to do that. And the buyer probably doesn't even have any opportunity to cancel at that point because they didn't list the items that they disapprove of.
Speaking of canceling, say a cure notice has been issued. What is the time frame to cancel?
So the cure period notice, you're giving the buyer, you're giving the other party 3 days to cure, okay, to go ahead and fix whatever it is that they haven't done or whatever they haven't followed up with. So the following day or the fourth day is when they would be able to cancel.
Let's see. So what happens if an investor tells you they're not going to provide the spuds? Should you issue a cure notice?
And I'm assuming that we're representing the buyer in this transaction. In the purchase contract, the seller's already agreed that they're going to deliver it within 3 days. So if the listing agent comes back and says, my seller's an investor and he refuses to fill out the spuds, then I'm going to issue that cure period notice right then and there. Okay? If the listing agent knew the seller was not going to complete the spuds, they really needed to counter the offer back and make sure that they stayed in and take those lines of the contract out. And the buyer then can make a decision, do I want to go forward? Do I want to pay for home inspections, appraisals, and things like this? Because I'm not going to get any information from the seller. The other thing that I like to tell investors when they're filling out the spuds, if they've never lived in the property, the language, there's some additional terms and conditions on the last page of the spuds. And that is an excellent place for the seller to state, I have never lived in this property. I'm not sure of the true condition. And the buyer is advised to thoroughly inspect to find out the true condition of the home. So that's another place where the seller can say to the buyer, hey, make sure you inspect because I've never lived here and I don't know the true condition.
So in your expert opinion, is it generally a good idea to steer clear of properties that do not include a spuds?
I wouldn't steer clear of it, depending on the price. Okay, you may be able to get a smoking deal on a property, and there's no spuds provided, and the buyer may be someone who buys a lot of properties, and they're comfortable with that. So, for your general buyer, I would not steer them clear. I would just let the buyer know that that they may have to do a few more inspections. They may have to, take that due diligence period and extend it for a little bit longer, because we're not going to have the advantage of the seller telling us information that they know about the property.
So what are the obligations in regards to landscaping and water irrigation?
Right. Well, and especially this time of year when it's very, very hot outside. In the contract, the seller agrees the home is going to be in substantially the same condition. That includes the landscaping. So the seller can't just decide to turn the sprinklers off to save some money on watering, because the grass was green when we purchased the property. Now it's brown. Plants have died. The seller's obligated to have it in substantially the same condition.
So how do you recoup losses with the air conditioning installation that didn't pass the inspection? Or can you?
Well, you can try during the BINSR, if during the inspection period the buyer has, and I'm not sure if this is where this question's going, but during the inspection period the buyer has the air conditioner inspected and requests that the seller replace the pan, the drip pan, and that's done incorrectly. And the buyer may not find out until after the close of escrow that that's done. Can you go back to the seller? Well, if the seller didn't do something that they agreed to do in the purchase contract, even after the close of escrow, you could issue a cure notice. It's not common, but you could issue a cure notice and you could take the seller to small claims court. But basically what you want to do is try to get back to the contractor that made the repair and see if you can get them back out there. Now the buyer, in the purchase contract, it states that the buyer is going to do a final walkthrough. And the reason that they're going to do that is they want to confirm the property is in substantially the same condition, and they also want to make sure that any repairs have been made in a workmanlike manner. So a buyer not doing a final walkthrough is not a good thing, and I would not be able to tell if the air conditioner, if I wanted repairs done, if they were done properly. So the buyer at their final walkthrough has the opportunity to maybe rehire the home inspector to come back out, or bring an air conditioning repair person with them that can confirm if those repairs have been done. It's easier to deal with bad repairs and issues before we close escrow than afterwards.
So if those repairs are not being done in a timely manner, what are your options?
I would issue a cure notice. Okay. Now, does the buyer want to do the final walkthrough on the day of the close of escrow? Probably not. Okay. The seller agrees that those repairs are going to be done, 5 days prior to the close of escrow. I'd have to look at the contract here. And we want to make sure that the inspection, that the final walkthrough is done right after that, so we can give the seller some time to remedy some repairs if they were not done correctly. The seller also agrees they're going to give you copies of any receipts. Now, if they had a handyman do a repair and they don't have a receipt, or they did the repair themselves, they just need to state that they don't have the receipt.
If the buyer has not completed the inspections on vacant land, but the seller will not extend will not extend the due diligence period, can the buyer still disapprove of the property if new material facts become available?
Most likely, yes. And I mean, anytime the buyer discovers new information that should have been disclosed, and with even vacant land, you still have that seller property disclosure statement. There's a specific one for vacant land. And the buyer finds out information that the seller didn't disclose, the buyer's most likely going to have a right to cancel, because that's new information.
All right, so do you have any best practices for properties that have issues and the clients are elderly?
That's always a tough situation when you have people that are elderly and maybe they can't even we've had a situation where they couldn't even really hold a pen to fill out the spuds. The best idea in that situation is to call in one of their children, family member, friends to fill out that seller property disclosure statement for them with their assistance. You want to make sure as the listing agent, I tell my agents, your ink should never, ever touch the spuds. You don't want to be the one that asking the questions and having the seller give you the answers and then you filling in the spuds for them. We actually had a claim on this several years ago where the question was, has the roof ever leaked? And the agent thought the seller said, no, it hasn't, so check the no box. Well, then lo and behold, after the close of escrow, the buyer finds out that the roof did indeed leak and went back to the seller and said, seller, you told me no. And the seller said, no, I told you yes. You checked the wrong box. So bringing in a family member with someone that is elderly or maybe can't remember as clearly, and then on the spuds to make sure you state that the seller has completed this to the best of their ability, but the buyer again is advised to thoroughly inspect, because the seller is not recalling everything maybe as clearly as they used to.
So your seller gets the list back of requested items to be fixed.
Okay.
And it is extensive.
100 items.
And they start to panic a little. So what are their options? What best advice do you have for how agents would deal with that?
Well, I mean, if the buyer in 100 might be something I've never seen, but I've seen close to 50. I've seen buyers request every little thing on the home inspection report. And unfortunately for the seller, I want the seller to respond to every request that the buyer has made. Yes, we're willing to make that repair. No, we're not willing to make that repair. So it's going to be a little bit of a longer process because the seller needs to address every item that the buyer requests. I would not recommend the seller just stating, we're not going to do anything, we'll credit you, $100, something like that. Best to reply to every request, unfortunately.
What are the most typical requests you see?
Well, they're usually the high ticket items that a buyer is afraid they're going to move in and then have a big repair. So the roof, the air conditioning unit, still seem to be really, really big items. A lot of buyers, due to agents having a good counseling session with them, will let them know that if there's nail holes in the wall, that's something we can take care of pretty easily and pretty inexpensively after the close of escrow. So roofs, AC units, termites, still a big issue, and getting termite treatment can be expensive.
Are those also typically what would kill a transaction if those repairs are not made?
Absolutely, absolutely. Especially in the lower price range. If the buyer has really saved all their money for the down payment and their closing costs, and they know immediately after the close of escrow they're potentially going to have to replace the air conditioning unit, to the tune of $6,000 or $7,000, and the seller's not willing to do that, that absolutely will break a deal.
So we're getting several questions about poly pipes.
Polybutylene. The buyer can certainly request that the seller replace polybutylene pipes, and keep in mind, the buyer can request anything that they want. The seller, of course, is not obligated now to make any of those repairs at all. Polybutylene piping years ago, and I don't even remember when it is that they were putting those in, had a lot of problems, and there were a lot of leaks and floods in homes due to that polybutylene piping. If a home has polybutylene piping, what I would highly recommend the buyer do is hire a licensed plumber to come out and give them a professional opinion on what the life of that polybutylene piping. There are many, many homes here in the valley with polybutylene piping that have had that piping, for 20 years that have never leaked. So just because it has polybutylene piping doesn't necessarily mean it has to be replaced, but you need to get a licensed plumber out there to see what they recommend.
So you're at an impasse. Buyer has requests, seller is not willing to grant those. What do you do? Do you have tips for how to handle negotiation tactics? Anything?
Keep polite, professional. Okay. Take the word we. Make sure that the word we never comes up when you're talking to the other agent. Okay, you always want to say, my buyer's requesting this. I'm happy to communicate that to my seller and get back to you. You never want to say we, because the other party is going to think, what are you, a buyer as well. I don't have any really good negotiating tips except for your buyer to know, make a list of what it is that truly is a deal breaker. Okay, and you may disclose that to the listing agent, you may not. It's going to vary from transaction to transaction on what it is that you might do. But an important thing that I wanted to also make sure that I noted, and some issues that we're having today, is that if you are listing a property and the buyer has requested 50 repairs, they've given you a copy of the home inspection report because, of course, the contract calls for that, and this transaction ends up canceling or failing, the seller is going to be obligated to disclose items that are wrong with the property to future buyers. And so there's a big question mark out in the industry is, can you take that home inspection report and give it to another buyer? And that home inspection report is good for the day that the home inspection was done only. Things may have broken after that, but the home inspection does a great job of telling the seller exactly what is wrong. So the seller needs to update the SPUDs with what's on home inspection report number 1 and make sure that that information somehow gets to buyer number 2. And if they end up making some repairs, they need to make sure that they've put that on the SPUDs as well.
So this is my worst nightmare. You've sold the home, and in between the seller moving out, the buyer moving in, the home is vandalized.
Yes.
Or something horrible happens.
Yep.
Isn't this why the final walkthrough should be done on the day of closing?
I don't recommend it be done the day of closing. Depending on the amount of repairs that the buyer's requested, you may want to do it a couple days before the close of escrow. But in the purchase contract, there is a risk of loss provision. So it states that on line 390, if there's any loss or damage to the premises between the date of the contract acceptance and the close of escrow or possession, whichever's earlier, okay, by reason of fire, vandalism, flood, earthquake, or act of God, the risk of loss shall be on the seller, provided that the cost of repairing such loss or damage would exceed 10% of the purchase price. If the vandalism is 10%, exceeds 10%, then either the buyer or seller may cancel the purchase contract. That does happen from time to time.
So going back to the BINSR, if you need a page 2, can you add?
Absolutely. You can use a blank white piece of paper, or you can use the AAR addendum, but you just want to note on the BINSR that there is an additional page. So if that page gets lost or somehow doesn't get through, we want to make sure that the BINSR isn't good without that additional page.
So when a buyer pays for inspections and then requests for a major repair, but the seller declines, buyer has no choice but to cancel. Does the buyer have any recourse on the money spent?
They do not. They do not. And it's important that the buyer's agent has that conversation with the buyer during their interview or their buyer counseling session, because the buyer may end up canceling on two or three properties, and they're going to have to pay that money up front for that home inspection, and they will not be able to recoup it.
We had a lot of great questions today.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you have any final thoughts, final takeaways you want to leave with them?
Just to keep in mind that unhappy buyers and lawsuits come after the buyer moves in and they're surprised by some sort of condition of the property that they were not aware of previously. So making sure that we always have our sellers complete the seller property disclosure statement, update the seller property disclosure statement, and make sure that the buyer has a professional home inspection and follows the instructions in that home inspection report. If the home inspector states buyer needs to have a roofer come out, you need to have a roofer come out. There's a lot of great home inspectors here in town, and I would make sure that the buyer checks their credentials before they hire them, before they pay them money, and then follow the professional instructions that the inspector gives them.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today, Trudy.
Thanks.
And thank you all for joining us. Our next webinar, Understanding the Eviction Process, will be on September 5th. And we hope to see you there, and have a great day.